Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are coming from. My name is Michael Watson, and I am the regional lead for the Microsoft reactors here in the Asia Pacific. Today, we are very excited to welcome you for this session by Deepak, and we will be kicking off in just a minute or so. I just want to give you a brief introduction of Deepak. So Deepak is a senior architect for Insight Enterprise Perth in Australia, and is an infrastructure architect with a strong passion for Microsoft Azure. So Deepak has more than 15 years experience and has worked in various roles and various events like Channel 9, Tech Ed, and Tech Ready. Deepak is also busy sharing his knowledge amongst meetups, and we are very pleased to have him join us today. So I will now hand over to Deepak, who will run you through Microsoft Windows Virtual Desktop. Over to you, Deepak.
Cool, thanks, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on the time zone you have joined in from. My name is Deepak. I'm Azure MVP, and I'm going to talk about Windows Virtual Desktop today. Just to give you a quick overview of Windows Virtual Desktop and what it is basically a Microsoft platform as a service, which provides a desktop in a cloud. So any user can connect from their devices and they can get access to the desktop in the cloud. The way Windows Virtual Desktop works, it provides the Windows 10 multi-session capability, which is very unique to Microsoft Azure, which people have been using as terminal services with Windows Server. Now it is also available in Windows 10, which means you can have multiple sessions of Windows 10 and running on a same virtual machine. And there could be multiple people who can connect to those sessions. Now, WVD, which is Windows Virtual Desktop, we'll call it as WVD as a short form. WVD also enables the optimization for Office 365. So if you are using Office 365 like Outlook, OneDrive for Business, you can also optimize these applications to run in WVD. And if you are a traditional remote desktop services customer who has been using remote desktop services in on-premises, you can even migrate it to Azure and run it as WVD. You can deploy and scale in minute. So it's in Azure in cloud. If you need 2 desktop, or if you need 20 desktop, or if you need 2000 desktop, you can simply scale it in minutes because it's running in the cloud, and you get the capability of the scaling those workload. Now, one of the biggest benefit of Microsoft Windows Virtual Desktop is that you don't pay for the infrastructure, which provides the WVD capability. The only thing what you need to do is you need to deploy the session host, which are actually the VMs, which provides you the desktop. But the infrastructure, which supports this WVD, like the connection broker, the web access, all these services are provided by Microsoft free of cost. Now, just to level set, this session has got few terminologies. If you are new on WVD, there are some terminologies you need to be aware of. So in terms of WVD services, we have got WVD service itself. It's called as Windows Virtual Desktop. You can have a look at it in Azure portal and configure it. Now, there is a new concept of Windows 10 multi-session, which I just talked about, which gives you the capability to run Windows 10 in multi-session mode. And this is only supported in WVD. It's only supported in Microsoft Azure. Now, there is something called FSLogix. This is a FSLogix profile management solution, which Microsoft acquired a few years back, and it provides a user and profile isolation from a desktop, which means you can have your profile centralized in a shared storage, and you can attach it to the session. So if user is connecting from one session to another, he will always have the same profile, regardless of which desktop he's connecting to. There's something called MSIX app attach, which also provides the capability to containerizing your application and attaching that application to the client operating system. Now, instead of installing all the applications and then giving those applications to user, You can also kind of create the application virtualization that's called as MSIX app footage and provide to the user. So whenever user logs in, and if he has access to the MSIX app, he would be able to run it regardless of whether the application is installed on that server or not. So this is kind of part of WVD services. Now, as part of configuring WVD components, you've got session host. A session host is a computer that hosts desktop or an application. So this is a typical Windows virtual machine, which is gonna run the applications and you would be connecting to those applications. Host pools means a group of session hosts. So you would not be deploying a single session host for large number of people. There would be multiple host pools which will deploy, and those host pools can have multiple session hosts. Remote applications, it is like an application which a user would be accessing, like Word, Excel, Outlook, or maybe Teams. This could be an application, or it could be a desktop. That's remote application. Remote application group means a group of applications you can combine together and give access to the user to access all those applications. Now, in WVD, there are two concepts. One is the personal desktop and another one is the pool desktop. Now, when it comes to the desktop, you have the choice. You can provide a dedicated personal desktop, means one-to-one mapping. A user would have mapping to one desktop, which means he would always be accessing that desktop. Whereas in the pool desktop, a user can access any of the session. It's part of Windows 10 multi-session, and then he would be able to access all of his data with the help of FSLogix profile. So depending upon the requirement, these options can be chosen. So if there is a use case when you have to run an application which is more performance intensive, like requires dedicated CPU or memory, a personal desktop would be a good option, like a AutoCAD or SAP workload, or any line of business application which requires more memory and CPU. So the personal desktop would be the ideal choice. Whereas the pool desktop could be good for users who are accessing like a applications which are more like SaaS based, or the applications which are more browser based, or the applications which are more light end user and doesn't require a lot of CPU or memory. In that case, you can use the option of pool desktop. Now with this, I'll kind of start on showing WVD, and I'll show you the experience of WVD to give you an understanding of how WVD looks like. So from the end user perspective, what I have is the remote desktop client. And what I've done is I have authenticated this client. So what I've done, I have provided my credentials, and with those credentials, I am basically able to see the applications which are published to me. And I'll show you how this publishing looks like. So you could see I have a bunch of applications. They're all part of one WVD workspace. And I can see I've got Word, PowerPoint, Outlook, Teams. These applications assigned to me. Now, on top of it, I also have pool desktop. Now, if I click on this pool desktop, I would be able to connect to my pool desktop. Now, just to save the time, I've already connected to the pool desktop, and this is how pool desktop looks like. So it's typically a operating system which I'm connecting, which is running Windows 10 multi-session. And I can do everything as I do it in my Windows 10 operating system. So I can have my line of business applications, I can run my application, and there could be a number of people who can be accessing the same machine at the same time. So it's not when I'm logged in, only I am able to run it. If there is anybody else who wants to access it, he will be able to do it, and he will have his own session. There could be a question, can I define how many number of sessions which we can have in pooled desktop? The answer is yes. When you create the pool, you can define how many number of user can access to the pool desktop. Now I'll kind of minimize and I'll show you the experience in Azure and how do you configure Windows Virtual Desktop. So I have got my Azure portal, and in this Azure portal, I've got a bunch of services which I've already configured. Now, as a first step, what you require the Active Directory, because all the WVD desktop, they also need to join the Active Directory. It's a Windows Active Directory. They need to join in. And you also require the Azure Active Directory. So the first set of authentication, it happens using Azure Active Directory. So if you want to apply any sort of, restrictions, or, if you want to use multi-factor authentications, you can all do it, because when a user basically requests for WVD, the request goes through the Azure Active Directory. So any restrictions and any policies you have defined in Azure Active Directory, that kicks in. So it could be conditional access, it could be multi-factor authentication, it could be privileged identity management, anything which you define in Azure Active Directory, that will be applied on your identity. Once you sign in, you would be able to log in and present it with your desktop as well as the application. Now, to make it working, what I have done is I have deployed a domain controller. So I have a domain controller which is configured in Azure. It's a Windows domain controller running on Windows Server 2016. I have also deployed a virtual network. So there is a virtual network which I have, and this virtual network basically is also working as a domain name server, and it has got the IP address of the domain controller. So what's happening is that a domain controller is configured, and the IP address of a domain controller is provided as a DNS server in my virtual network. So if I deploy any virtual machine, that virtual machine is going to receive this IP as its DNS IP, which means it can register itself or join to the Active Directory when we configure the pool when it comes to the WAD. So this is kind of an initial setup which I've done. I also have AD Connect running, which is synchronizing with my Azure Active Directory. So this is kind of a minimum setup you need to have in order to configure WVD. And if you're doing a WVD proof of concept, you can even deploy a test domain controller, or you can also use Azure Active Directory domain services. So that's another option you can also use in case if you are just doing POC. But in any production, you can always deploy a domain controller in Azure, or you need to have some way of hybrid connectivity to connect your domain controller from on-premises to Azure, maybe a site-to-site VPN or Express route. So once it's done, what I'll do is next step, I'll go and configure WVD. So I'll come and open up Windows Virtual Desktop, and under the Windows Virtual Desktop, I can see a list of hosts in my host pools. I can look at my application group, which is a group of applications I talked about, and a workspace means all of these things are reporting under a single workspace. I can create multiple workspace if I want to have a different business unit and I want to have WVD configuration only for a specific business unit. I can have two different set of workspaces created. So this is more for organizing your resources, or you can even check all those workspaces, sorry, all those host pools in a single workspace as well. So let me show you how the WVD host pool experience looks like when you kind of, when you start with WVD. So the first step is create. And when you click on create, what it's going to do, it's going to ask you to select your Azure subscription. It's going to ask you to select your resource group. So maybe I'll create a new resource group. And I can give a name of this pool. So I'm just giving a name as new demo, or you could just give whatever you want to give a pool name, maybe a pool for POC or production or anything you want. I'm selecting a location to keep my metadata. So I'm gonna select the East US2. That's the region I generally select for my subscription. Now I can select whether, sorry, I can select whether it's a validation environment or the production environment. So it doesn't make any difference. This is good for understanding. So if I am actually looking into my WD configuration later point of time, I can see I just created it just for proof of concept, means I can clean it if I don't need it. This is just that kind of a metadata. I can select it no or yes. By default, it's selected as no. And then I need to select what kind of host pool do I need to select. So I have two choices, personal or pooled. Now the personal, as we talked about, it's a one-to-one mapping. So every user who logs in would be assigned with one desktop versus the pool means bunch of people can share a single virtual machine. So I'm going to select pooled here, and then here I can define the maximum session limit. So there is a sizing and guiding available on Microsoft website, which tells you how many session limit you need to define. But again, it all depends on what is the VM size you're selecting. So if you provide a right set of CPU and memory, you can go 4, 6, 8, concurrent session. It's not a problem. But just for the simplicity, I'm selecting 2 sessions, but you can go more number of sessions based on you're giving at least one processor per user. That just makes it much more easier. Otherwise, your WD experience will be highly impacted. Now, there is a second option in terms of load balancing. Now, when it comes to multiple sessions, now how do you want to load balance your session? There is a two mode. One is the breadth first, and the second is the depth first. Now, the breadth first, the way it works is if you have got, let's say, 4 session host. Now, if user 1 comes in, it comes on session host 1. If user 2 comes in, he comes on session host 2, and the third user comes on session host 3, and the fourth user comes in session host 4. Versus if I go depth mode, now what will happen based on my session limit? For example, here I have 2 session limit. My first session host will receive user 1 and 2, and then my second session host will receive user 3 and 4. So means I'll need to fill in those session limit before I go to new session host. So ideally, it's a good idea to use breadth first, but there is an option to select depth first as well. Maybe if you want to make sure you don't want to turn on all the VMs unless until the required number of VMs are filled with the session. So depending upon strategy, you can use which mode do you want. But for this demo, I'll select the breadth first. The next thing what we need to do is we need to select the virtual machine. Now, in terms of the virtual machine, it gives you an option. You want to select it now, or do you want to create it later? Now, I want to create it now. So I'm selecting, defaulted to same host pool. Yep, that's the resource group I want to use. And I'm going to give the name as WVD demo. So what it's going to do, it's going to create like 01, 02, 03 based on how many session hosts I have selected. Now it will select WVD demo and 01, 02, and it'll keep creating like that. Now, which image do I want to use? So I can select a gallery image, or I can even select the image from my storage blob. If I have my gold image, I can update or I can upload it to the blob storage in Azure, and I can use that image as well. But it's always a good idea to use the images as gallery images because they are updated in Microsoft Azure. They are always like latest patch update and they are tested images. And in this section, I can select the multi-session and it shows me different version of Windows 10 to select from. So I can select maybe the latest one, version 2004 with Office 365 apps installed. So one option, I select only the operating system. And if I don't use, let's say the Office 365 images, Office 365 apps, I don't need them. Like I don't need to select that image. So based on the requirement, I can select what image I require. So I'll select the Microsoft 365, which means it's pre-baked and I don't need to install it once the operating system is installed. Just mind it, if you have, let's say, if you are deploying 100 VMs, and if you are not installing, or if you are selecting the image only with Windows 10, but later you realize you require the Office 365 as well, then you'll have to go back or create a new pool. So, so this is quite easy. If you need, you can create more and more pools as well. You can even have few pools just with Windows 10 and few pool with Windows 10 and Office 365. So it can totally be depending upon your requirement. Now, the second thing you need to do is what's the size of the virtual machines you want to use? And that's where the Azure magic comes in. You can select multiple sizes. You can go VM, which has got a high number of CPU or high number of memory. This is totally depending upon your application requirement. Some applications are more, um, processor intensive. Some applications are more memory intensive. So or you can go with the VMs, which have got a good ratio of processor and memory. So depending upon the requirement, you can select the image, VM size. I'm just going with the default one, but this is something you need to plan before you actually deploy. You can change those, but remember, if you are selecting and deploying 100 VMs, then it's a problem for you. Then you'll need to change for all of them. So maybe for number of VMs which are going to get deployed, I'm going to use 2. That's much easier because it's just for demo, so I don't want to add more and more VMs. I can also select for my operating system what kind of hard disk needs to be there. Should it be premium, standard, or standard HDD? So I'm going with the standard SSD, and I'm good with that. Now, in terms of networking security, as I talked about, I already have got the network created. So what I just need to do is from my drop-down list, I need to select my network and I can select the, subnet where my WED VM is gonna sit in. And do I want to apply a network security group? Do I want public inbound ports? Any of those things, I can do it here. Now, once I do it, I can also select, do I want to join specific a domain? And I would say yes, because I want my WED VMs needs to be domain joined. And I can select the name of the domain. And I can actually even define the OU. So if I've got the organizational unit where I want all these VMs to go and sit in, I can even select that. Now, I don't want them to go in a specific OU. Otherwise, I can provide the OU path. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to add them in domain. And for that, I'm going to supply the credentials. Now, it also asks, do you need to create the admin credential for the VM itself? Yes, I'm going to do that. I'm going to supply the password for it. So this is kind of straightforward. I can do and next select the workspace. It can attach to a workspace, or you can do it later as well. So I'll select WED demo. That's a workspace which I have created, and all my VMs are sitting in that workspace. So you could see this is my workspace, and if I create more and more pool, they will all be displayed here. But if I create a new workspace, I would be able to see another workspace if I have the permission to access those virtual machines or those desktop sessions. So I'm gonna select my existing workspace and I can select text. Since it's a demo environment, I'm not gonna select the text and it's gonna validate. And once it validates, I can simply click on review and create. And this is gonna create the environment for me. So I will click on create. It's gonna take almost 8 to 10 minutes to create all these VMs, and then it's going to reboot, join to the domain. So yes, it would take 10 to 15 minutes of time to make sure all these VMs are ready to be used. So I'm not going to show you the process where it's taking time. So what I'll do is I will come and show you the actual state. If I can reach there. Oops. Okay, I'll go to Windows Virtual Desktop. So this is where I created the host pools, and so you would see there is a new host pools which is getting created. It's not available yet. It's getting created. It just tells me all the info that how many VMs are there, which location it is in, what kind of subscription it is in. Is it a personal or a pooled, desktop? So I already have got a host pool with the name pool, and I'm gonna select that. Now, as a next step, what I'm gonna do when I have my pool created, once the pool is created, I can simply come here and I can assign my application. So what it's going to do, it's going to assign application for my user. Now, there are two types of application. One is my desktop, means it's going to provide desktop as an application, means it's a multi-session. I can even define whether I want to provide those desktop to my users or not, or if I want them to only access the application. So I can select it, because when a user logs in, and if I don't provide these applications, he would not see the application. He would only see a desktop, and he can click on desktop and access the applications internally. Or I can simply only assign the application, or I can assign both. Now, in this case, I have created both the pools. I've configured. If I go on remote app, you could see it's gonna show a list of applications. I'll come under the application and it will show what all applications I have assigned. So it's pretty straightforward. I can go and add an application. Is it going to be a start menu application? Do I need to provide a file path, or is it a MSIX package, which I'll talk about in a minute? So I can provide that path and that application can be published, and then I can assign. So the next step is I can assign that application to a user, or I can assign that application to a group. Now, in this case, I'm using a user, which is part of WED users. His name is Stephen, and then he would be able to access those applications. Now, same thing, I do it for my host pool. And in that host pool, I come and look at my assignment, and I can see I have given that to my user as well. So that pretty much I have done to assign my applications as well as my desktop to my end users. So which means if an end user is part of this group, once he logs in, he should be able to access these applications. Now, just kind of a quick demo and walkthrough of the environment. I'll go back to my deck and I'll continue to talk about it, and then I'll jump back in the demo again. But at any point of time, if you guys have any questions, feel free to post it on the chat window, and I'll be able to answer questions maybe during the presentation, or maybe at the end of the presentation. Now we got all those applications in our app, and we were able to connect to those applications as well as the desktop. Now, how does it look like and how does it all work? So if you look at the flow perspective, what we have is the end user, which have got the client installed. So the remote desktop client can be downloaded and installed. Once you install it, you can access these applications. Now, there are a couple of components which makes this WED work. The one is the Microsoft managed environment. And as I talked about, as part of remote desktop services, you're required to deploy a gateway, broker, web access, and a SQL database to keep all the connection information. Now, all this part is done by Microsoft for you. So you don't manage it. Microsoft manages the scalability of this environment. Microsoft manages the high availability of this environment. And the best part is you don't pay for it. So in a typical on-premises deployment, you would need to have a WVD environment, or I would say the remote desktop services or VDI environment running. And then you need all these components. So this is like an infrastructure component you require. And then here you have got the VMs, because what happens when a user tries to access this? The first thing the user does, basically user tries to authenticate. And when then user tries to authenticate, user gets the remote desktop, sorry, user gets the Active Directory token. And then that user presents that token to remote desktop, sorry, WED web access service. And what web access service does, it basically looks through the token and the permission that what session host as well as application this guy has access to. Once it's done, user selects the application, it connects to the gateway, and it uses the encrypted connection. So it's on port 443, and you basically deploy those VMs. Sorry, you basically access, those VMs using the gateway. Now, once you go through the gateway, it just makes a connection. And if it is a desktop, if it is an application, you get connected to it. So that's how the connection flow works. And just to repeat, the whole infrastructure is all managed by Microsoft. What you need to do is you just need to deploy the session hosts, which are going to run your applications or your desktop. And you just pay for them. And you can simply use this WVD environment. So there is a question of how do you back up WVD VMs? So in order to back up WVD VMs, you can use Azure Backup, or you can also take the the snapshot service to take a snapshot of your VMs. So treat these VMs as your other VMs in Azure. Just mind it, the profile is basically kept in the FSLogix, which can be further kept in Azure storage, and that can also be backed up using Azure Backup. But in a real world, you would not want to back up your VMs because you would want to treat these VMs to be, stateless, which means you can deploy whenever you require and you can clean them when you don't need it. All the data sits in the profile. All the applications can also be redeployed if you have the image which has got the right application installed. So, so this is how the architecture looks like. You've got the on-premises environment, and you can have the session host running in Azure. And in the right side, you could see they have got the FSLogix configured, which means they have their profile saved, in a separate location. It could be Azure file, it could be NetApp file, file share storage, or even it could be a file server storage. Now, the way it will all work is basically a user would connect to the session, and then he would be presented with the VM. He makes any changes, all the profile data, it all gets saved into his profile, which is detached from his VM. And whenever the VM is not accessible, or if he's accessing another VM, he would be given the same profile again and again. But in order to make this work, you require the Active Directory domain services to be configured. Either they should be in Azure or they should be accessible from on-premises as well. Now, with this, we'll move on and talk about the profile management. So as I talked about, the profile is basically isolated from the virtual machine, and profile can be kept completely separate. Now, this all happens with the help of FSLogix. By default, if you do anything on a WVD VM, that will all still stay in that operating system. Now, to make it separate from the WVD environment, you need to install FSLogix. Now, this is a free service from Microsoft. And what it does basically, it creates a VHT or VHTX as a file profile container. So when you install this service, and you configure the FSLogix. So there are group policy settings, which I'll show you in a moment. You can configure them. And with that configuration, you have got your VHD or VHDX profile based on what you select in your group policy gets created. It uses the same approach as user profile disk, which is UPD. And what it does is it basically mounts it when you log in. So the moment you log in, your profile gets attached to that session, and all the changes what you make, it stays into that session. So not only just your files data, your browser history, your desktop customization, they all stays in that profile and it roams with you. So if you make any changes to your desktop environment, it roams with you. If you save any file on your desktop, it roams with you. Doesn't matter if you are connected to the same machine or not in a pooled environment, you'd always be presented with the same session. So it gets redirected the moment you log in. So user profile management with FSLogix. So it optimizes the profile container. It is much faster than the roaming profile and folder redirection. It can help you pick from multiple storage option in Azure. So you can use Azure files, NetApp files, and file server cluster. I would not recommend you to use the file server cluster, but yes, that's another option you can do if you've got a good high performing storage behind it. But in most of the cases, people use Azure files, which also provides the SSD based capability, or the NetApp files, which is another option for faster storage in Azure. You can even migrate your existing user profile. That's one of the options available as well. So there's something called MSIX app attach. So again, this is also part of FSLogix. Now, with the help of FSLogix, what you can do is you can basically create the MSIX app. And what MSIX app does, it allows you to access the app in the same way like you access any application which are presented to you. So user logs in, he connects to the virtual machine, and then his profile gets loaded. And with that profile, you get the VHD where your MSIX file is. So let's say if you do not want to install line of business applications on each and every machine, you detach that application, create the MSIX app, and then you keep it separately. So any user, so example, there is an accounting user, he needs the accounting, application access, and that user basically can be given with the accounting application. So wherever he logs in, since he has that permission, he has that access, he would be presented with that application. Whereas other users, they log in, they would never be given that application because they don't have a permission on it. And that user can run that application. Data is saved in separate profile. So we are actually making VM as more like stateless. It doesn't have any state, doesn't have any application. You can scale, scale in, scale out, or you can create on demand. So maybe you require WVD for 100 users, 1,000 users. You deploy it, your applications are isolated. The moment you don't need it, you can just scale back in. So that's the benefit you get when you use the option of MSIX app attach as well as the FSLogix. So it reads the application assigned to the user once it's presented, and you can even register those applications. So even applications like VS Code can be given so to developers. You can even do it that you don't need to present all the application and user is confused which application he needs to use based on who is accessing the application. He would be see a list of application based on his assignment. So you have two choices. One, you give all the application, or you basically give just application based on their login, and they will only be able to see what applications are assigned to them. So that's the choice you get it with the MSIX app attach. So MSIX also comes with one feature that's called as app masking. And what does app masking do? You can even hide an installed application. So you have an option to containerize the application. Means application is completely isolated. It's like an app virtualization. It's a container. It can roam around. You can even mask an application. So let's say you have a line of business application which can't be containerized, but you don't want to give an accounting application to everybody. So what you do is you do the app masking, means when the accounting user logs in, only they would be able to see that application and only they would be able to run that application. If anybody else logs in, those people would not be able to see it and those people would not be able to run it. So that's the benefit you get it with the app masking. So why MSIX? You can use a single format for physical or virtual environment. It doesn't require any specific sort of packaging, and you can do a clean install, uninstall. It's secured by default, and it optimizes the storage and network bandwidth. For app attach, it's the dynamic application delivery. It can only be given to the authorized users, and the app looks like it's installed natively. So if you got the app attach, so you would not feel the app is actually coming um, from a profile. It will look like the app is actually installed locally. So with this, I'm gonna show you the demo for FSLogix and app masking. Now, so what I've done is, in order to configure FSLogix, as I talked about, I have yep. Okay. So yeah, so this is my domain controller, and on this domain controller, what I've done is I have basically configured my group policies for my FSLogix. So by default, what you do in order to make the FSLogix profile configuration work, you download FSLogix. You can go to Microsoft website and you can basically download FSLogix. So it's downloadable. You can download FSLogix, and once you download, it provides some sort of a zip file for you. You can extract it, and what you can do is you can install this on each and every computer. So if you see here, it's the FSLogix app setup. So it doesn't require any other information, and you can simply run it, and it install the FSLogix. Now, FSLogix basically is an application, but it also needs a rule which you configure. So there are two choices. One is you can configure those rules in a registry, or you can even configure those rules using the group policies, or you can configure some of those rules, pre-baked in the image itself. So whenever you deploy, you've got the same rules configured. Now, in my case, I have used the group policy, and I'll show you quickly how does those rules look like. So I will basically show you the FSLogix, and now within this one, within this one, I have got two files. One is the ADMX, and second one is ADML. So these are the two files, which are the which are the group policy files. They basically gives you the option to configure the options for FSLogix. Now, I've already copied these files to the group policy location under the sysvol. And what I have done is I will go on my group policy editor, and under the group policy editor, I have created the group policy container. And within the group policy, I would go under the administrative template, and under the administrative template, I'll see the FSLogix. Now, within that FSLogix, I can configure. There are heaps of settings. I may or may not need it. I can configure, for example, profile container. If I select here, I would be able to see that I'm using the FSLogix profile. So I'm enabling the FSLogix. So it says, do you want to enable the FSLogix? Yes, I want to enable the FSLogix. And I also want to basically define a VHD location. Now, in order to make this work, what I'm using is the Azure storage, and I've created a file share storage in Azure, which is basically my UNC path. So I'm using the file.co.windows.net. That's my Azure file storage, and I'm providing that path. So there are a couple of steps which need to be performed in order to make the Azure file share to be used for the FSLogix profile. I have already done it, and I'm gonna provide that UNC here. Once it's done, all of my profiles gonna stay at this location. Now I can define other configuration. They're all available on Microsoft website in terms of what you want to configure in FSLogix. You may not want to configure everything. It is based on what kind of optimizations you want to provide. So if I go on advanced, um, cloud cache, so there are other configurations which I can also configure. So maybe I have used the virtual disk type, and I'm using here is the VHDX. So you can select, do you want to use VHD or a VHDX format for your profile? So the VHDX is more, more faster in comparison to the VHD. So that's the option. And I have configured this all through the group policy. And I have applied this group policy to, to the organization unit where all of my, session host gonna sit in. So what I also did as a step, I created I created the organization unit and all the VMs which got created. I moved them under the session host. So and I applied my group policy on this OU, which means all the VMs sitting in this organization unit would get all these policies applied to them. So two options: use it with the registry mode, do it on every computer, or you can even bake it in the image itself, or you can do it through the group policy. So you can choose what option you want to do. Because once you do it, what happens is when the user um, connects the application, I'll show you how it looks like. What it basically does, it basically attaches the VHDX, and that VHDX basically is kind of a temporary storage for that user. So here, what it does is it just creates a profile. So every session which is kind of created, that session has got this profile attached. So all the configuration, all the settings, they all sit into this shared storage, not sitting on my C drive. So that's the profile it gets attached when you configure the FSLogix profile. Just go back and yeah. So that's what I've done. I applied it on my session host using the group policy. Now, I was also talking about the app masking. Now, what does app masking do? App masking basically makes sure you only make that application visible to the intended user. Now, how do you do that? You basically run the configuration wizard for configuring the app masking. Now for that, you again install the FSLogix app rules editor. They're again all part of the same download. When you download the FSLogix, that zip file that has got the FSLogix app rule editor. Once you install it, basically it will just go and sit in your start menu, and you can configure the rule. Now, the trick is you need to run it as an administrator. It took some time for me to find out why my app rules are not getting configured. Now, what I'm doing here is, and just to kind of save time, I'll just make it smaller first. Now, I'm just trying to hide an application. Now, what I've done is I basically creating a rule, and I can hide any application. Means I can, let's say I don't want to give MS Paint Notepad to a user. I know these are not line of business applications. It's just an example. But let's say there is an application which is installed sitting in C program files or C Windows, and I don't want anybody to access it, or I want a specific set of people to access it. I can create those rules. Now, how do I create those rules? I can basically scan my installed application, and it's just gonna create all the dependency of that application. Now, in this, what I've done, I have got my Chrome, which is kind of scanned. Now, just to test this, what I can do is I can click on this button, which is basically this button, which is gonna basically apply this rule to this system. And then in my left side, I have got a Chrome browser. But if I apply, that browser will be disappeared. Means now nobody would know even I have a Chrome browser. Obviously, this is not the right approach. What I can do is I can scan these rules, and then instead of applying it on a local system, I can provide a permission. I can do an assignment. Who can access this? Who can't? The rule set does apply. So I'm creating application hide rule, and this hide rules are only going to be applied to these set of people, or it can be applied to anybody else apart from these people. So there is a bit of permutation combination you can create. And once you do it, it's gonna spit out one file for you. And this file, you can save it under the program files and FSLogix apps and rules. So what you'll need to do is this file, once it's created, whatever rules and permissions you're defined, you just need to copy and keep it under this folder in each and every session host. Now, when a user logs in, these rules will kick in, and if he's trying to access the application, he would not be able to do it because he doesn't have permission to that application. So this is how you can do the app masking. Two options. One option is if you want user not to see even the application at all, then it may happen if the application has got the icon file, you also may need to hide the icon file. But if you have made the application hidden, even if he has got the icon and if he's trying to access it, the application would not work for him because he doesn't have access to it. So this is a good way you can restrict who can access what kind of application. Yeah. So there is a question about, can I switch desktop pool to a personal pool? That's a very good question. The answer is no, you can't. You need to select the pool when you create it, but you can't switch it once they're created. So yeah, this is something you need to plan it before you create any pool. So I'll kind of minimize. If you have any questions related to FSLogix and app masking, feel free to let me know. So I'll move on. So there are a couple of options for image management. I use the gallery image and I can use those images. It works fine for me. But there would be a scenario I would want my custom image because I have a few line of business application which Microsoft is not going to provide to me. So you have multiple options. You can create a cold image, create a virtual machine in Azure, install all the line of business applications, and then maybe generalize it, and you can use that image again and again to create another images. That's a good option, but at the same time, you would always need to make sure that the operating system is up to date, and then you'll have to keep doing this task. Or second option is you can use Azure Image Builder. So this is a service which basically allows you to define the source of the image. It could be the marketplace image. You want to customize it further, and what you can also do is you can distribute it. So you can distribute this image to a multiple location. So if you have got WVD, which needs to be deployed at multiple locations, maybe offices in Australia, Europe, and US, you can select those locations and the image would be available on those locations, because image is always a region specific. If you customize an image, if it is in Australia, means you would only be able to access in Australia. But with this image builder, you can not only customize the image, you can create a definition of the image. And once the image is created, you can even distribute it to multiple locations and deploy the WVD environment from there. So this is what I was talking about, the shared image gallery with VHT. It allows you to have 3 different locations where you can have the image which is shared across, and you can use different storage to make it highly available as well. Now, in terms of your WVD monitoring and diagnostic, you can use Azure Log Analytics, or you can even use your on-premises tool or the existing tool, what you use it to monitor your infrastructure. So that's also an option you can go for. Now, in terms of pricing and sizing, so the pricing depends upon each and every region. So this is the Microsoft guidance when it comes to selecting the workload. If you've got a light kind of workload, you can have like 2 vCPU, means like 3 users per CPU. like a six user per kind of a vCPU kind of environment. You can go for 8 gig of RAM and different Azure virtual machines to choose from. The moment it becomes light to medium to heavy in power, you could see the CPU requirement will increase. And again, this is kind of a guidance which Microsoft is providing for the multi-session. It may or may not work for your environment because this would require a little bit of testing. And that's the benefit of Microsoft WPD, that you can create a POC environment, you can play around with it, you can see what kind of virtual machine works fine, you can collect user experience, and then lock in the actual VM profile you want to go for. Otherwise, I have seen in most of the cases, people generally go for 4 to 6 vCPU because the applications sometimes require more CPU and RAM initially when it loads up, and later doesn't require that much. But 4 to 6 vPU can easily handle 3 to 4 users in any environment. That's the case. You also have an option to use single session or personal desktop. That's the option you can also go for. It all depends upon your workload. Now, since it's dedicated, you really are giving that one VM to one user. Again, this requires a little bit of testing, and there are some sizing and guidings available from Microsoft. But again, it is up to you. How do you want to provide the sizing to your end users? Now, there is something called experience estimator. So if you are not sure what kind of latency you're going to get when you access the WED, so Microsoft has an experience estimator. If you go to this website, it's going to tell you from your location what's going to be the latency for the nearest Microsoft Azure region. So if you are in the same city, you might see the latency is less. Like I'm in Perth, my closest data center is in Australia East and Australia Southeast. And if I go there, I see 60 to 70 millisecond latency. So that's the case even if I use ExpressRoute. That kind of 50 to 60 millisecond latency I will be getting. But it changes based on where your location is. Now, this helps in case if you are designing a WED solution for your global customer, you might want to check from each and every location what kind of latency you're getting. So it may happen you might be getting a better latency round trip from a far Azure region than the nearer one. So this is something which can help you if there is a latency intensive application. Again, you can size it by using this estimator. Yep, this is the estimator. It's just kind of changing my latency. In the day, I was seeing 70 to 80. And now right now it's showing 131. Looks like my internet is not that great right now, but it can change. So you could see my nearest is Australia East. But if I deploy my VDI desktop in somewhere like Switzerland, this is the latency I'm gonna receive. So this kind of helps to understand what would be your WED experience gonna look like. So we are almost at the end of this session. Just to kind of wrap up, why Windows Virtual Desktop? So Windows Virtual Desktop provides you the infrastructure. You can use Windows 10 multi-sessions, based operating system. It provides you the cost-effective compute and storage in Azure. It provides you the flexible networking provisioning. Typically, whenever it comes to deploying any WED or remote desktop kind of solutions, you require a lot of infrastructure and a lot of testing. But here you have a lot of flexibility. It provides you the best value compute rate because it uses the Azure. Now, if you want, you can use the Azure reserved instance. If you really want to use those VMs for a long time, it reduces your cost further. And it provides you the OPEX model instead of the CAPEX. You don't need to invest in your infrastructure. It's more like a OPEX model. The WED licensing, it covers your RDS-CAL as well. So if you've got Windows 10, if you got the right licensing, you really don't need to pay for the CAL. It also helps you to migrate your Windows 7 end of life workload to Azure, and it just helps you to lower down your labor costs because you're not managing the whole infrastructure. What you're just managing the session hosts and the application, what you want to present to the user. But from a infrastructure which supports WAD, as well as storage, the networking, and the actual servers where the VMs are running, that all are actually managed by Microsoft. So it provides a lower labor cost when you're using the platform as a service instead of a traditional infrastructure as a service in on-prem or even in Azure. Yep, so with this, I am done for my session. I think I'm almost on time. I'm like a couple of minutes over. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions.
Well, thank you, Deepak. What a really informative session, and I know that there was a lot of interest from the audience. There was one question that remained, which I wanted to just clarify, which was, can I still use my existing management solutions with WVD?
Yeah, so the answer is yes, you can use your existing investment. The only thing what you need to make sure is that you are able to connect to that environment. So if you've got a hybrid connectivity with the site-to-site VPN or access route, yes, you can extend those management solutions in Azure or can be accessed, or can help you manage your WAD environment as well.
Fantastic, fantastic. All right, with that question, that is the end. Deepak, I want to thank you very, very much for that session. It was, as I said, highly informative and very engaging. For the folks on the call, on the session, we have a survey in the chat. If you get a chance to fill that in, that would be great. It helps us to continue to find and identify the content that you're interested in and continue to provide that. We are constantly looking for new content, so we would love your feedback. This session will be put up on our YouTube channel in the next day or so, and so I please encourage you to go and check out that and also look at other sessions that we've done previously. We'll also be publishing new events on our meetup page, so continue to follow that and identify events that best suit you. And with that, I would like to wish you all a great evening, great day, wherever you are in the world. And we look forward to seeing you next time on one of our reactor sessions. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you, everyone.